Hudson is a city that has been evolving for centuries. It is a city of many names and many facets. Home, business, entertainment, gateway to Wisconsin. This is the story of Hudson. The French were the first Europeans to come to the Lake Superior region as explorers, traders, and missionaries. The French search for wealth in America in the early 1600s did not reveal gold. However, wealth was discovered in another form, in the fur trade. Some of the earliest French explorers included fur traders Radisson and Grossier, who in 1660 built a cabin on the southwest shore of Chequamegon Bay. In 1680, explorer Daniel Greysolon Sieur Duluth, known as Duluth, used the Brule-St. Croix waterway as a shortcut from Lake Superior to the Mississippi River, and thus opened one of the principal waterway trade routes. The fur trade would become a lucrative enterprise and a dominating influence in the Great Lakes region. The St. Croix and Mississippi rivers served as transportation and shipping routes for the fur trade. But the French were not alone. Upon their arrival in this area, they found a tribe of the Algonquin Nation known as the Ojibwa or Chippewa, and the Dakota, or the Sioux Nation. These rival tribes had been at war for generations. The Frenchmen took to the woods as traders and trappers and became close partners with the Chippewa, married their women, and produced a progeny of mixed-race Métis, who became an ethnic group in their own right. The French voyageurs and their descendants often remained in the wild and adopted the customs of the natives.
A gift for you.
Having been armed by the French, the Chippewa were able to dislodge the Sioux from their homelands. The Sioux were driven from the forest lands of present-day Wisconsin across the St. Croix River. The river eventually became an informal and generally accepted boundary between the Chippewa and the Sioux. The portion of the St. Croix River below the confluence of the Trade River is known as the Grave Marker River in the Ojibwa language. On early French maps, it appears as Rivière de St. Croix, meaning the River of Holy Cross. There are several different stories of the origin of the name. It may be named for a cross marking the grave of an early French trader, or for a rock formation in the shape of a cross, or the many graves of fallen warriors. We will never know for sure why it was called Grave Marker. The border dividing the Chippewa and the Sioux was always in flux. The Chippewa legend of Catfish Bar illustrates the tension between the two tribes over the disputed land that modern-day Hudsonites now call home. Local historian Steve Anderson tells the story, which has been passed down for generations.
So the story goes, following a battle between the Chippewa and the Sioux near present-day Red Wing along the Mississippi River, the only two surviving Chippewa braves were returning home north along the St. Croix River. It was the custom amongst these tribes that following a major defeat, the survivors would not eat anything until their return home. This was an act of self-discipline, even self-punishment, for losing the battle. Starving, these two Chippewa Indians reached the southern end of Lake St. Croix, where they found a large catfish on the shoreline. The one brave's hunger was so great, he decided that he must cook and eat the catfish. The other brave warned him not to violate the custom prohibiting eating until they should return home to their village. Nevertheless, the first brave, starving, cooked and ate the catfish. They fell asleep by the shoreline that night, and the next morning when they awoke, the second brave discovered, to his horror, that his companion had turned into a giant catfish there on the shoreline. Eventually, the sands washing up on the shoreline covered over the dead giant catfish, and thus became Catfish Bar.
The Battle of Willow River is another conflict of note. It took place around 1785 when the Chippewa attacked the Sioux on the shores of Lake St. Croix at the mouth of the Willow River. This is the location of present-day Hudson. These battles interfered with the fur trade. Many of the trade routes were endangered and sometimes closed. To secure the Brule-St. Croix waterway, forts were established. Duluth is credited with establishing Fort St. Croix at the portage in 1680. In 1694, Fort Le Sueur was built on an island in the Mississippi, just below the mouth of the St. Croix River. In the Treaty of Prairie du Chien of 1825, a council of natives and whites met to promote peace and establishing a dividing line between the Chippewa and Sioux. The truce line ran from the north at the Red River in present-day Minnesota to the south near the present-day city of Eau Claire. The line bisected St. Croix County. While attempts were made to survey and stake the line, neither tribe respected the boundaries, and fighting between the Chippewa and the Sioux continued. It was another treaty that opened the door for settlers. In 1837, the Sioux and Chippewa signed treaties with the United States that opened all the lands east of the Mississippi River for settlement. As soon as news of the treaty spread, development began, opening up the rich timberlands and fertile prairies. While the land was being organized, fur traders continued to utilize its bounties. The French fur traders were a nomadic people. They followed game up and down the river and into the forests. Many of them had hunted and trapped in this area as early as the 1680s. Where the St. Croix and Willow Rivers meet, several Chippewa families lived high on a bluff in the northwest corner of what is now Hudson, just off North Street. This location gave them a superb view of any approaching canoes, including Hudson's first settlers, French-Canadian Louis Massey and his brother-in-law Peter Boucher, a French Indian fur trader. Prominent Hudson historian, the late Willis Miller, talks about these early pioneers with Dick Larson.
The Boucher and Massey came to Hudson in the spring of 1840 and were regarded as the first residents of our community. They lived, to begin with, they lived down at the foot of St. Croix Street in Frenchtown. Boucher and Massey, of course, were both Frenchmen. They had been removed from Fort Snelling. They had been there earlier, and they came to Hudson after the treaty, wasn't it?
Well, they came out of the Red River settlement, and
well, they settled at Fort Snelling.
They settled at Fort Snelling in 1827.
But they were asked to leave there, and so they came to Hudson.
And they filed on the land. I mean, these were pretty canny guys, because the Indian Treaty of 37 really took place.
That's right.
Got involved in 1838 before it got signed, and the news got back here.
They were some of the biggest landowners in Hudson to begin with. They had the
property right away.
Lorraine Jacobs, a descendant of Massey and Boucher, talks with Steve Anderson about Hudson's first settlers.
The French were the first whites to really encounter the Native Americans, and they came here in the fur trade. First they came as explorers, but then the fur trade took over as the economic factor. In Hudson here, we had a number of French explorers that passed through on the St. Croix River. These French explorers opened up the trade routes and were soon followed by the voyageurs. And amongst those voyageurs that came this way were two interesting men, Louis Massey and Peter Boucher. These are the two men that were really the founders of what ultimately came to be known as Hudson, Wisconsin. And Lorraine is here to talk to us tonight about these two men. How is it you are related to these two men?
Well, Louis Massey is my great-great-grandfather, and Peter Boucher was his brother-in-law. So his sister was married to Louis Massey. And I got curious about them What was this area like before Massey and Boucher came? I knew it was Indian Nation.
But at the time that Boucher and Massey came here, it probably right here in this part of the St. Croix River, it would have been the Santee Sioux that they first encountered, with Ojibwa coming into the area. But when do you think Boucher and Massey would have first been coming into this area?
Well, they couldn't have come before, I don't think they came before 1826 or 7. And this is when they came down from that Selkirk Red River colony. And this is where they were born. Massey came down in a Red River cart train. And a group had come down from there because of floods, but about 250, 60 people came in that group. Now here they were, all these people, in these Red River carts. It is some picture. Poor things. You go as fast as the oxen would go. They brought their herds with them, whatever they had. They had heard that some people had been accepted at the fort. Now, there was only 9 square miles of land that the white man could be on legally.
Fort Snelling.
Fort Snelling. Zebulon Pike had arranged with the Indians, or treated with the Indians, for that much land. The rest was Indian Nation, so the Indians didn't care about them being there. They didn't plan to stay all the time. Some were just passing through or going on further, but they had to rest a while. Well, some stayed, as Massey did, for 13 years.
Well, now weren't both Massey and Boucher also guiding officers and visitors to Fort Snelling over from the fort to the St. Croix River area here on hunting and fishing expeditions?
Oh, they did. They took them up the Willow River. They took them up the Apple River. Now, in the spring of 38 is when they came over here.
So by 1840, both Massey and Boucher are over here in what's called Willow River, and they have pretty much divided up what is present-day Hudson between the two of them. The town was only just beginning here, so
It was a settlement. It wasn't even a town, it was a
but
settlement.
Hudson really didn't get on the map in terms of trade. The first steamboat up here is in the 1830s, but it doesn't stop here. It goes on upriver to the falls and such. But by the 1850s, of course, we do have a town developing. Do you know where Boucher's house was in Hudson area?
Yes, it was between the elevator and the Star Observer, where the elevator used to be and the Star Observer used to be.
So we're talking about down in Walnut and
right on the water.
Yeah, street down there. Now, Massey, there's a plaque on a rock over at 1113 First Street that notes that it was on this site in 1840 that Louis Massey, Hudson's first white settler, had erected a home.
And you know this, for this group of people that came down from the Red River, that settled on the reservation, the Fort Reserve, are also considered the first white settlers of Minnesota.
One of Hudson's first prominent entrepreneurs was Captain John B. Page. He came to the St. Croix Valley in the mid-1840s.
John Page worked for the Mormons at Nauvoo, and he was busy up here in the 1840s cutting wood for this fast-growing Mormon community in Illinois. And he was born in Maine, was reported to be a sea captain. He sailed his own ship.
Of course, he was a steamboat man here too, you know.
Yes, but he was a logger here primarily.
They were some of the original people. They came in between 1845 and 1847. And his daughter, Abigail Page Bailey, was the first white child born in Hudson on the day the first steamboat came into Hudson.
Palmyra.
The Palmyra.
And he lived, he logged, did some steamboating, I think some rafting, ran the raft boats, And riding his horse down 3rd Street by Orange Street, he had a stroke and died. He was a great big man, about 6'5", and he got off the back of his carriage and sat down on the ground and died by the courthouse.
And you know, it's interesting too that he has connections with Cyrus Snell.
Yes, he does.
Silas Snell. Silas Snell was on Captain Page's steamboat, and Snell remarks that, wouldn't it be a nice thing if I could be buried in that high promontory, which is now Liberty Hill for us. And Page said, well, if you do die here, I'll bury you here. Well, never thinking that those words turned out that he had to fulfill his promise. Young Snell did die, and they had to bury him, and they had to cut their way up to Liberty Hill, and they dug the grave and buried Silas Snell there, who was reportedly one of the first two white people to be buried in this area at the time, and that was in 1847.
Captain John Page had the first logging operation on the Willow River.
Page in 1845 had the first logs. He was from Navarro, Illinois, and then he brought in Mr. Parrington, and they started a mill out here called Parrington's Mill on the Willow River in about 1847. Parrington had the misfortune of dying at a very young age. And he built this mill at the south end of the Willow River. It eventually became Staples Mill and eventually became other mills.
Captain Page and his wife Eliza eventually settled in Hudson. When Eliza arrived in the fall of 1846, she was the first white woman to settle here. She was noted as a successful practicing Thompsonian physician. John and Eliza's daughter, Abigail, married George Bailey in 1868, and they farmed on the east 80 acres of the original land that Captain Page received as a grant. The farm was located at the site of the Hudson High School.
Well, I'm Jan Penman Fusel, and this is my mom, Eleanor Penman, and she's lived in Hudson all of her life. So, when were you born, Mom?
October 1st, 1918.
Right, and where did that happen?
My dad's farm up on the Hudson city limits. John Henry Brewer was his real name.
What kind of a farm was it? Did you do a lot of milking of cows?
It was more a dairy farm.
This is the farm that we spoke about that's atop of Vine Street, and there's the old farmhouse. They say that Abigail Page was the first white baby born, I suppose, not an Indian baby, in Hudson area, and that they also lived on that property. And then you were born there.
Captain Page is also reported to have cleared some of the first land for farming in 1848. This period would bring wheat farming to the Hudson Prairie and shape the growth of the town then known as Willow River. The area where Hudson is now located was first claimed by the French in the 1600s, and soon after by the English. English rule ended in 1783 when the land was officially ceded to the United States. In 1787 it became part of the Northwest Territory, which was later divided into smaller territories and states. The St. Croix River Valley was first included as part of Indiana Territory, then Illinois Territory, and later part of Michigan Territory. Wisconsin became an organized territory of the United States by an act of Congress passed on April 20th of 1836. It included the present-day states of Minnesota, Iowa, North, and South Dakota. As land was settled, the Wisconsin Territorial Legislature passed a bill that created St. Croix County on January 9th, 1840. The original boundaries of the county encompassed 50,000 square miles, including the part of Minnesota east of the Mississippi River and large parts of western Wisconsin.
An election was held to determine the site of the county seat. Brown's Warehouse, later called Dakota and now Stillwater, won out over Prescott at the mouth of the St. Croix River. At that time, the settlement that became St. Paul was not considered important enough to be a county seat.
St. Croix County was reduced in size in 1845 with the creation of LaPointe County from the northern half of the county. Wisconsin officially became a state in May of 1848 with the St. Croix River as its western border. The county seat of Stillwater was no longer in St. Croix County. This left the new St. Croix County without a county seat until the first Wisconsin state legislature met in June 1848 and made Willow River the new county seat.
As expansion continued, some settlers wanted to branch out. In the spring of 1849, part of Willow River petitioned to become a separate town known as Buena Vista, meaning beautiful view. The separate plats of Buena Vista and Willow River were short-lived. In 1851, the two settlements were combined and again called Willow River. This caused considerable dissatisfaction among some of the residents, so in November of 1852, the name Hudson was adopted. The name of Hudson was suggested by Alfred Day. Many of the Easterners living in the area were impressed with the similarity between the Palisades of the Hudson River in New York and the bluffs of the St. Croix River.
St. Croix County assumed its present boundaries in 1853 when the state legislature set off both Polk County to the north and Pierce County to the south. With growth came more settlers, and with more settlers came mail. Doc Philip Aldrich was Hudson's first postman. Aldrich came to the St. Croix Valley from Ohio back in the early days when Wisconsin was still a territory. In 1840, Aldrich was given the contract for carrying the mail from Point Douglas to St. Croix Falls, making the trip twice each month. In 1847, he established an overland mail route from what was then Willow River to St. Croix Falls, with the mail being carried weekly on foot. He was appointed the postmaster in November of 1849 and continued for 2 years.
Philip Aldrich was a man of many talents. In 1844, he was appointed St. Croix County's first judge and served as county commissioner. The first meeting in present-day St. Croix County was held at Aldrich's home in September of 1848. He also operated a ferry across Lake St. Croix. Aldrich was buried in Willow River Cemetery in 1858.
1854, this area was called Willow River. First post office was here in 1848. Post office down here, the oldest building in town. Oldest building in town at the end of what we call Front Street now. There's still if you go to Buckeye Street and go to Buckeye and First, take a left, and you'll see two little houses as you go south. Then the second house down was the old post office. That street had like 30 businesses in it, that Buckeye Street. It had 3 hotels. It had several warehouses, several hardware stores. Some of the spillover went down First Street on both sides of the street. It was called Front Street then, not First Street. People like Coit, which is a local name of great impact. People like Dr. Hoyt had a store down there. Simmons had the American Hotel, which we talked about. Dan Anderson had one of the Swedish hotels, which burned down next to the Boucher House.
Another important pioneer to arrive on the banks of the St. Croix was Amma Andrews. He was a builder whose work can still be seen today. Reverend Merlin Bradley shares the story of the First Baptist Church, which was built in 1866 by Amma Andrews.
People, the remarkable building that you see here has a story, and you need to understand the setting into which it was born. Now, Hudson was settled in 1840, and during the early years, say 10, 12 years, the only way in and out of Hudson was by boat. No roads, no railroads, no stagecoaches, nothing like that. Eventually, a man arrived, a carpenter arrived in Hudson and changed everything. He is the man that designed and built this building. His name was Amma Andrews. And he built not only this beautiful building, but that beautiful building, the O'Brien building across the corner, and Greek Revival houses up and down this street and all over. He was a pretty remarkable builder. Only a carpenter, but he had a secret. He had this book by Asher Benjamin, and he put out this book, this is just a copy of it, to help builders on the frontier build worthy buildings, mostly in the classical and Greek Revival style. That's how Amma Andrews knew how to build this. He got the information from this book, and even suggestions on the detailing, the brackets and cornices and doorways and proportions of everything. It's all in here.
In the early days, the Darling O'Brien House was considered one of the most outstanding homes in the St. Croix Valley. Its beautifully proportioned pillars and large windows gave credit to its builder and architect, Amma Andrews. Willis Miller comments on the house.
This is the Darling O'Brien House. We always used to think it was built in 1857, which has recently been found out that it was built in 1855, the same year that the Octagon House was built. It was built by Amma Andrews, who was the premier builder of Hudson in the period before 1880.
In 1853, Amma's twin brother, Amasa, came to Hudson, and they worked together in the contracting business. Many of Hudson's great early homes were constructed by the Andrews brothers, including several of the classic Greek Revival-style houses that still line Vine Street. When a new county courthouse was needed in 1857, it was Amma Andrews and his brother-in-law, John Comstock, who built it. The courthouse served the community for more than 40 years. The imposing stone structure replaced a short-lived wooden structure on the same site at 3rd and Orange Streets.
But you know, our courthouse was where Hudson held all its plays. It's where the Hutchinsons performed. The Hutchinsons also performed at Hindy's Hall. You know the Hutchinsons were? That's the most famous musical group ever in this part of the country. They were sort of the early Chautauqua players. And they sang right across the street. They also sang at the courthouse. This was the only building that had enough size to it. They had dances there in the courthouse, believe it or not.
The old Willow River Cemetery was platted by Amma. Sadly, one of the earliest graves is that of his second wife, Martha Andrews, who died 3 years after settling here.
Martha Andrews was the first burial in the Willow River Cemetery. This stone was placed there in 1850.
Amma Andrews died in 1888, and he is buried at Willow River Cemetery beside his third wife, Catherine. Amma's brother-in-law, John Comstock, and his wife, Lydia, arrived in Hudson in 1856. John was a carpenter, miller, and an influential businessman in Hudson. Comstock's greatest business triumph was the First National Bank of Hudson, established in 1863. Until its sale in 2007, the First National Bank of Hudson was the second oldest national bank in Wisconsin and the 30th oldest in the United States.
John Comstock was the founder of the First National Bank and a very wealthy man, and did a great deal for our community and was quite instrumental in getting the railroad to come through here.
The city of Hudson incorporated in 1857, and John Comstock became its third mayor in 1859. In 1860, he defeated Otis Hoyt to win a seat in the state assembly. Comstock was one of the foremost leaders in promoting railroad development in the region and served as a local advisor for Daniel Baldwin, president of the West Wisconsin Railroad. John and Lydia Comstock's home at 804 Vine Street was built in 1857 by Amma Andrews. Pat Colton, the current owner, talks about the Comstock house.
It's just a really, really well-built house. And it was built by Amaya and Amasa Andrews. And when John Comstock and Lydia first came to Hudson, they lived up in the Octagon house for 2 years, I guess, while their house was being built over here. As I did all the rooms, I restored all the hardware that I could, and so that was a much simpler, plainer house. All you could tell, like some of the woodwork when I did it, that it was all handmade. You could tell that like things varied a little bit in their sizing, and the nails were all made at a blacksmith, and so it was interesting.
The Comstock family book documents all Comstocks everywhere. Our family is listed on 4 different pages. This is John Comstock here, and it lists through all the family. I'm not sure the real early history of him here, but part of his banking, and like Pat mentioned, all of his legislation, very active in politics, in not only the city and the state, but also in national, going to D.C.
Aside from politics, banking, and real estate, Comstock was also very successful in the flour milling industry. He also invented a system using sewage gas to heat buildings, which in the 1880s was successfully used in Paris, France.
And the annex was a gift of a lady named Lydia Comstock. Lydia gave this as a gift, and it was state of the art. It even had a sink with running water in the kitchen. It was a wonderful thing, and she gave this in honor and memory of her husband, John Comstock, who is one of the great names of early Hudson. That man was fantastic. The achievements in his life were mind-blowing. He brought the railroads to Hudson. He was an inventor, but he wasn't much of a churchgoer, really. He was a member of this church, but not that involved. But his wife was, and she gave the annex addition in his honor.
John's health began to deteriorate in the late 1880s, and he died on January 3, 1890, leaving a great legacy in Hudson. Herman L. Humphrey was the first Hudson resident to become a United States congressman. Humphrey and his family built the first brick house in Hudson at 803 Orange Street. The home has been restored and is now owned by Wayne and Jean Hout. Wayne talks about the Humphrey house.
The house was built by Herman Humphrey, who came to Hudson in 1855 and started his law office. He moved here from New York and built the home in 1860. While he lived here, he was a man of many hats. He was the mayor of Hudson, he was a district attorney, a circuit judge, a county judge, a U.S. State legislator, and also in the U.S. Congress for 2 terms in 1876 and 1880. So he was a very notable man. He died in 1902, and his wife Kitty lived here till 1926. At that time, a couple from Stillwater bought the home, a carpenter and his wife, Susie Daly, and the carpenter was injured, and they needed to start something that he could do without being a carpenter, and they started a grocery store. And so they turned the living room into a grocery store, and he ran that until he passed on in 1936. Susie Daly started a hospital, a birthing hospital here, a laying-in hospital, in 1932, and ran that until her death in 1942. So we had grocery store and hospital at the same time, which was kind of interesting. Soon after she passed on, the Gartmans bought it, and most people in Hudson would remember it as Gartman's grocery store on the corner. They ran the grocery store from the 42 or 43 when they bought the home until probably around 1970.
Janice Fusel was born at the Daly Hospital. She talks with her mother Eleanor about the hospital.
And I was born in the summer, July 1937. What do you remember about that day and what it was like?
Yeah, dailies, that's where
Was
it's
there,
sort of like a household, a hospital, you know. But I think they had a little store connected with it.
I think it was a doctor who delivered me. And years later, someplace in my trunks, I have a receipt. It was $20.
The Octagon House, another prominent home in Hudson, was built in 1855 for the Moffett family. It is now the Octagon House Museum and the home of the St. Croix County Historical Society. Historical Society volunteers Tom and Jackie Hugdahl often portray the Moffetts.
Well, good evening, folks. Welcome to the Octagon House. Let me first introduce my wife, Nancy, and I am John Moffett. We lived in the New York area and I worked for mercantile companies for roughly 10 years, and then we decided we needed to find something else to do, and we wanted to go west. Some of our relatives had already moved out here to Hudson, which was then a frontier to us folks in New York.
Well, 3 of my sisters were already living in Hudson and 1 in Roberts.
Yeah. Eventually 4 of my brothers and a sister ended up in the Hudson area as well. So we packed up our daughter, Mary, and headed off to Hudson, Wisconsin.
Oh, was that a trip. We had to take the train from New York to Galena, Illinois. That was a long trip. And then we got on a riverboat from Galena and went up to Prescott. And in Prescott, you had arranged for a buckboard to be there to meet us. And we came into our new home of Hudson.
We already had done some thinking about what kind of a home we wanted to build. On the East Coast at the time, the octagon type house, the 8-sided house, was very popular and quite the rage. So when we came west, we actually carried this book by Orson Fowler, who was promoting and describing in great detail the house. So in 1855, when we wanted to get the house built, we hired a fellow named Brady as a contractor, and he built and completed the house for our occupancy in 1855. But we lived in the home for over 102 years. They found a community that was very vibrant. That there were 5 sawmills in town. They were harvesting the big white pine stands that they had along the St. Croix Valley. They had churches had begun to be developed. There were doctors coming on board here in town. Roughly 1,000 people here were here in 1854. And in 3 years, that had risen to 2,500. So they found a very busy community that they chose to put down their roots, and they lived a pretty full life right here. John and Nancy Moffett, along with their daughter, came to Hudson in 1855. They were looking for a new start in life, and John did that. He became a lawyer in town here, a very successful one. Represented a number of the railroad companies here. He served as a judge for the St. Croix County 2 terms, I think it was about 8 years. And he practiced law well into his 80s. So he made a mark in this community.
Well, I just think the music, it was so much a part of the family. Mrs. Moffett came and taught piano here, and then their daughter with her beautiful voice and her music. And then Mary's son John, he was so involved, and in fact he was the choir director at the Baptist Church for over 50 years. And they often had choir practice right here at the Octagon House. So music was such an important part of the family and part of the house, because it would be a gathering place where people would come and there would be concerts in the evening.
John Hughes and his sisters Betty and Mary were the last generation of the Moffett-Hughes family to grow up in the Octagon House.
I'm John Ingram Hughes, and I'm the last surviving member of the family that built and lived in this house for 4 generations. And I was born on May 8th, 1919, in this house. Well, my father is John Moffett Hughes,
Right.
and he is the son of Mary Bennett Moffett, who is the daughter of John Shaw Moffett, who built the house.
Okay.
John Shaw Moffett built the house in 1855. He brought his family here from upstate New York. The Octagon was a kind of a fad in upstate New York.
Mm-hmm.
There were a number of them built, and when my great-grandfather thought it was a good idea, and he brought the idea out here.
Okay.
And of course, it was very easy to build a house here. This was a really wilderness. He was outside of where everything else was. He has this acre of land, and there's a lot of white pine around here. So this house is built with 6-inch thick slabs of white pine, vertical, going from the ground all the way to the top, 2 stories. And that's why it's so pretty well insulated. The Octagon thing is a fad. It turns out to be a pretty good economical shape. Our across the street neighbor, Phipps, Stephen Phipps's father, was the land commissioner, and he hired my dad, and who they then hired on as a secretary, and worked his way up to be the land commissioner of the department, the head of the department, where he stayed there till he's retired.
Peggy Stern, the great-great-granddaughter of John and Nancy Moffett, shares a story about her uncle John Hughes.
Yeah, he's he's out east, but he has quite a few memories of the house, of course, living here, and remembers sleeping up in the sleeping porch. That's where I guess he would sleep most of the time in the summer and the winter. And there is a story up there in the sleeping porch where evidently they were all out there one summer and there was a bad storm and the lightning hit the corner of the sleeping porch, created a fire, and of course it was very loud. And from that point on, my grandfather decided to put lightning rods on the house after that incident.
The Hughes family sold the home in 1957. 7 years later, the Octagon House was purchased by the St. Croix County Historical Society, who has operated it as a Victorian museum since 1964. Longtime Hudson resident Ruth Burkholder talks about the purchase of the Octagon House.
My father was one of the founders of the St. Croix County Historical Society. He was on the Phipps, he was a director, one of the directors of on the board of the Phipps Foundation. And we all worked very hard to raise the money to buy the Octagon House. For $30,000, we bought the Octagon House. It's a far cry from the prices of today.
Museum director Heidi Rushman asks John about his former home becoming a museum.
When the house was eventually sold to another family, I wonder how did you come to that decision? How did that make you and your sister feel?
We were worried about what was going to happen to it. She would come up here on vacations and sit and talk to my dad on the porch, and he was worried about what was going to happen to this house when he left.
Do you think your father would be happy with
Oh boy.
the way things are now?
Yeah, he's grinning in his grave.
Is he?
Yeah.
You've been introduced to some of Hudson's early settlers. What brought them here? Opportunity. Massey and Boucher first traveled the area in search of game and furs, but the first major industry in Hudson was lumber, and the St. Croix Valley was rich in lumber's chief commodity, white pine. The Chippewa and Sioux treaties of 1837 opened the St. Croix Valley to the lumber industry, but the land had yet to be surveyed, so loggers were not able to file land claims. But with demand for lumber high and with fortunes to be made, Many loggers illegally cut timber on public land and sent logs downstream to the mills. Towns cropped up along the river with large mills set to cut boards. Hudson would become one of these river towns. By 1845, Captain John Page had a crew of loggers working near St. Croix Falls, and 2 years later he had set up camp on the Willow River. This prompted Hudson's first sawmill, when in 1847 James Puritan started building a mill but died before it was completed. When the first monster log was converted into boards, Puritan insisted the boards should be kept and used for his coffin. Not too long after, Puritan died and a coffin was needed. Thus, in 1849, the first boards from Hudson's first mill were used for the casket of James Puritan. The mill languished after his death due to a lack of capital. A new company was formed and the mill was finally completed in 1850. Salmon and Clark Mill, J.W. Pierce Mills, and several other mills were built on the shores of the St. Croix River, including mills at the foot of Vine and Buckeye Street where Lakefront Park sits today. These mills provided work for many men and promoted other businesses around them, from brewers to blacksmiths and general stores.
This is the marina now, but if you will note, this was the old log boom. In the days of the lumber companies, there were a great many sawmills. In 1870 and 1880, there were 17 sawmills between Hudson, Lakeland, and Afton. This logs, of course, would be put in rafts and boomed down the river and go into the sawmills at this point. The last of the sawmills left Hudson in 1917.
From the St. Croix River into the lake from 1837 to 1903, the number is astounding: 11,285,835,720 feet of logs. Brought in by railroads into the lake from 1837, well, that wouldn't be 1837, 1870, into the lake until 1903 was another 158 million feet, and by rail or river estimated into the lake from 1904 to 1915 another billion feet, totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of total rafts of Lake St. Croix, 12,444,000,000 feet of logs.
As is the case with most booms, a bust was just around the corner. The Central Lumber Company was the last remaining sawmill in Hudson. It can trace its origins back to 1856. The mill changed hands several times until it was purchased by Robert Slaughter and Henry Svensson in 1899. Emil Nagel, a nephew of Henry Svensson, became the manager of operations in Hudson in 1910 and held that position until his death in 1962. Emil's son, Fred Nagel, shares some history of the Central Lumber Company.
Yeah, it was started in 1899, or the last day of 1899, and two men, Robert E. Slaughter, and Svensson was his name, bought out a mill that had been there, and I don't know the name of it offhand, and then they kept the thing going until 1917, and then Svensson moved to the state of Washington. He started Cascade Lumber Company, and then Rob Slaughter stayed here, and my father started working for Central Lumber in 1902, I think, and then eventually Svensson died in 1910, and so then Rob Slaughter had to spend more time involved in Washington, so my dad sort of became the manager of Central Lumber, and then they shut the mill down in 1917, and now the mill is was where the boat livery is now here in Hudson.
By 1910, the forest lands were depleted, and only a few mills were operational after World War I. The last log drive on the St. Croix was made in 1913. Despite a declining lumber industry on the St. Croix, the Central Lumber Company continued to be one of Hudson's largest companies, employing as many as 200 men through 1914.
I think one of the reasons for the success is that a lot of the other sawmills had shut down and all the logs were coming down the St. Croix River, and they didn't own any timberland. They only cut or bought the logs and then cut them.
The last whistle at the sawmill blew on November 10th, 1917, signaling the end of the lumber era on the St. Croix River. Central Lumber changed its focus to retail lumber and operated in Hudson as the local lumber company until it closed in 1970. When the blades of Hudson's last sawmill came to a halt, the valley had been lumbered out. The epic stands of white pine on the river bluffs were gone. Little remains of the great industry that fueled the St. Croix Valley's wealth. The men who prospered left behind hillsides of stumps and splendid Victorian homes as monuments to the now gone majestic white pine.
This region was part of the largest white pine forest on the face of the earth. And did you know that they cut it down in one generation? Oh, they said it'll last forever. It's inexhaustible. Well, it didn't last forever because they had to rebuild Chicago after the Great Fire there, and they were building all these things in Minneapolis and St. Paul. That pine tree there is a hint of what was here. That would be a small one. The trees that were here in those days were gigantic. You couldn't even reach across. At Anderson Window, back in their factory someplace, they've got a cross-section of one of those trees that is unbelievable, the size of it. All gone. All gone.
Central Lumber was not the lone survivor of Hudson's lumber boom. Anderson Windows was started right here in Hudson. Arriving in America as a teenager, Hans Jacob Anderson first worked as an East Coast lumberjack. By age 20, he was in Minnesota, carving out a career as a building contractor, wholesale lumber, and eventually a sawmill owner. Hans moved his family to Hudson in 1896, where, with his father-in-law, he established a sawmill and formed the Wisconsin Lumber and Building Company.
Another one of Hudson's famous people would be the Anderson family. And Willis, talk to me about H.J. Anderson and his family, will you please?
All right. Hans J. Anderson came from Denmark at an early age, and he settled in Minnesota. And he came to Hudson in the early or the closing years of the 19th century. And he was in the window business, and he was a contractor. And he made the wise decision to standardize the size of windows. And that, of course, established the Anderson fortune. And he had a very successful business here, but they moved to Stillwater.
He had a big factory in Hudson.
Oh, yes. And they moved lock, stock, and barrel to Stillwater, or to South Stillwater, which is now Bayport. But of course today the Anderson are the greatest manufacturers of windows and patio doors in the world.
In 1903, Anderson and his family founded what would become the Anderson Corporation with a revolutionary idea to standardize window frame sizes and mass-produce windows. Anderson moved the company to Bayport in 1913, where he had access to 3 railroads. Another innovation of Anderson's was the creation of profit-sharing benefits.
It's interesting too about H.J. Anderson. He died in 1914. In December, he had been downtown. He went downtown to sign with his attorney for the Anderson, turned out to be their profit sharing contract. On the way back, he dropped dead on the street.
That's been one of the great...
And he was one of the very first to have profit and sharing in the business.
Anderson visited his doctor, complaining that he didn't feel well. Tragically, he collapsed and died while walking back to his home on Vine Street. Anderson's son Fred was responsible for the phenomenal development and growth of the Anderson Corporation. He died in 1979 at the age of 92. Deforested lands gave way to a new industry, farming. The forest was exchanged for fields and farms that would bring new immigrants to the area. Like the lumbermen, farmers arrived in the area before the land could be surveyed and began growing crops. Congress passed the Preemption Act of 1841. This allowed the squatters the first opportunity to buy the land for $1.25 per acre. This policy was eliminated by another act of Congress 20 years later, granting 160 acres of land to any settler who farmed it for 5 years. This obviously drew farmers to the area. The clear-cut timberlands could be planted with wheat before all the stumps were removed. Wheat was well adapted to the needs of pioneer farmers. It could be sowed with a minimum of soil preparation and then ignored until harvest time. Cyrus McCormick's invention of the reaper made harvesting wheat even more efficient. And during the 1850s, wheat rivaled lumber as the St. Croix Valley's chief export.
One of the things that we find interesting about the area was that logging in the early days was not a primary source of income for these folks. A lot of these people, as you said, had farms in the area. A lot of them grew wheat. In fact, our major crop in this area during the period of 1850 to 1870 was wheat. A lot of oats. Potatoes were sold at $1.50 a bushel.
Green's Paradise Mill produced flour under the name Paradise and became the first grist mill in St. Croix County. It was built in 1854 on the Willow River, 2 miles upstream from Hudson. Proximity to the St. Croix and Mississippi rivers gave the county's wheat farmers a transportation advantage for shipping their crop to national and international markets. By 1860, St. Croix County led Wisconsin in wheat yields. In 1867, Daniel Baldwin built 2 flour mills at the mouth of the Willow River on the same land that James Puritan had claimed and built a sawmill on 22 years earlier. Baldwin constructed 1 mill on each side of the mill pond. 10 years later, he sold them to John Comstock and some of Comstock's business associates. In 1877, Comstock, Clark and Company began updating the mills. A few years later, the mills were churning out over 500 barrels of flour per day. Modern-day Hudsonites have no doubt heard the name Burkhardt. Just northeast of Hudson, Burkhardt was once a center for St. Croix County's agriculture. Christian Burkhardt, a German immigrant, came to the U.S. in 1854 and built a mill above Willow Falls in 1868. In addition to milling flour, Mr. Burkhardt operated the only pearl barley mill in Wisconsin. Farmers from as far away as Pleasant Valley brought their wheat to Burkhardt for grinding. But what made Burkhardt famous was electricity. He was the first man in Wisconsin, if not in the United States, to transmit power for milling or factory purposes, having received this idea while on a visit to Germany in 1890.
Electric power, of course, was unknown and undreamed of when Amma Andrews built this building. But it did finally come. Electric power came in 1893. Christian Burkhardt brought it here. He was the big entrepreneur in electric power, but he had a partner who was a member of this church. And by some coincidence, this was the first building in Hudson to have electric lights. Burkhart's partner, James Andrews was his name, he invited all the Baptists in Wisconsin to come here for their annual meeting. I have it right here so that he could showcase how far this church had come from the wilderness days.
Just like the lumber boom, the glory days of wheat came to an end. Land became more expensive, and by the 1870s, yields began to decline. After years of planting the same crop, the soil became depleted and the fields were more susceptible to pests and disease. As transportation evolved, farmers were able to ship fresh dairy products to the major cities. The transition was difficult, but dairy farming would eventually become a more reliable source of income for Wisconsin's farmers. And so came the development of the dairy state. Before railroads came to Hudson, wheat, lumber, and just about everything else that was imported and exported from the area was shipped by boat.
In the mid-1830s, Lewis Massey and other trappers and guides traveled the river by canoe and keelboat, but as logging began along the river, the first steamboats carried lumbermen, equipment, and supplies to the sawmills upriver in Stillwater and St. Croix Falls.
The Palmyra is believed to be the first steamboat to traverse the St. Croix River in July of 1838. But it was nearly a decade later, on April 15, 1847, before the first steamboat docked at the foot of Buckeye Street in what was then known as Willow River. At that time, the city was still in its infancy, but steamboats would make traveling and eventually settling along the shores of the St. Croix River much easier. Willow River's population boom began in earnest when the steamboats started running. In 1850, Willow River's population was 500. In 1855, it had doubled at just over 1,000 people. Just 2 years later, the city of Hudson was incorporated with a population of 2,500 people. During the 1850s, warehouses lined the banks of the St. Croix. Among these were Powers and Evans, Kuhn, Platt, and Birch, Cox and Lem North, and James Mann storages. There was a huge wharf with a lake frontage of 100 feet that 7 steamboats could load from at one time.
This is O'Connell's Point. This is the end of the Cooley Road. And this is where the steamboats would land in the early days at this point.
There were three landing sites for steamboats. The lower landing, Page Landing, which was this major city wharf where most of the ships came in. There was Central Landing, and then there was the upper landing, which was right down there. Am I in the right place? Right down there at the big sign. The Central Landing was at the foot of Commercial Street, and the lower landing was at Buckeye Street. 1850-53, we had about 50 boats a year landing here at that time, steamboats. These were mostly about 100, 120, 30 feet long. They were light draft boats. You had a heck of a time getting up the river. It didn't have locks and dams. Well, the town grew and it prospered, and a lot of interesting folks were here. The boats came in, as I said, they had their own message. Each of the boats had their own whistle as they came in. The community waited for the first boat of the year. I mean, this is like, you got to realize that the overland transportation in that time amounted to about 3% of our gross product, and about 3% of our gross immigration came overland. But most of our people came here by boat, and they came here in the summer, spring, summer, and hopefully by autumn they were here. These folks came and they settled in this area, and there were 7 or 8 hotels. As many as 400 people a week coming into this community, settling on land. In November of 1854, 80,000 acres of our land was sold by the land office here in Hudson.
As farming expanded on the Hudson Prairie and to the east, Hudson's wheat exports grew. The city was the main grain market for the entire region. Strings of ox teams could be seen at daybreak extending up the street for several blocks, awaiting the opening of the warehouses to unload their wheat. Samuel Merritt, a prominent Hudson businessman, was the first to use the Mississippi River to ship wheat by barge. In the early days of the St. Croix River steamboat era, the boats were more functional and beautiful. They were of lightweight construction with shallow drafts of less than 18 inches, as the wild rivers had many snags and sandbars that would catch deep-hulled boats. Typical cargo carried to St. Croix River settlements included barrels of mackerel and codfish, beans, whiskey, barrels of apples and tobacco. Horses, cows, and poultry also shared deck space. Exotic items like window glass and china dishes were loaded alongside cases of garden seeds and furniture. Return cargo consisted of wool, hides, maple sugar, baskets of berries, and of course lumber and wheat. By the 1850s, packets which offered more luxurious travel were steaming up and down the St. Croix. First-class passengers would enjoy strolls on the second-level deck, entertainment, elegant meals, and private staterooms. Deck passengers would pay less to travel on the main deck among the cargo, livestock, and wagons.
Hudson's steamboat landing became the major immigrant port of entry for the Wisconsin side of the St. Croix Valley. Newcomers from many different countries disembarked in Hudson for the rich prairie lands to the east of town.
By the 1860s, steamboat traffic on the St. Croix River was bustling as Hudson developed a diverse population. But its days as the primary mode of transportation in the region were numbered. Railroads were being developed, and steamboat traffic began to decline.
The railroad changed the logging industry. One of the reasons northern Wisconsin and upper Peninsula Michigan was never exploited was that there was no way to get the logs to market. The railroad saved a lot of the steamboats. What happened was that these old boats that were up and down the river were no longer used for goods and service and people movement, were turned into ships that rafted the logs down the river. And some of these old steamers lasted until the 1910s, 20s on the waterway. And some of the ones that we have today, of the old breed, really came out of that market.
Steamboats were still used as ferries until bridges were built across the St. Croix. Hudson had two main ferries, one to Lakeland, Minnesota, and another from North Hudson to Bayport. Construction of the Hudson Toll Bridge in 1913 ended the ferry business in Hudson, but excursion boats still paddle the waters of the St. Croix today. They're now powered by diesel, but the nostalgia of the steamboat lives on. In the early years of the lumber and wheat industry, the St. Croix River and the Mississippi River worked well for long-distance shipping. However, when new markets opened in the Plains states to the west, overland transportation became necessary and the railroad became the most practical way to ship products. Railroads began in western Wisconsin in 1854. And in 1856, when Congress set aside nearly 4 million acres of the public domain in Wisconsin for railroad construction, Dr. Otis Hoyt led residents in the Hudson area in an effort to attract railways to the region. The St. Croix and Lake Superior Railroad Company was started in 1853, but soon failed in the financial panic of 1857. The Civil War also took attention away from the railroad effort. Dean Thilgen talks about those early railroads.
It was actually before the Civil War that the railroads were planned. A big land grant was going on before the Civil War. The states then got a hold of this federal land, and they were then able to divide out the routes and offer these to enterprising people to build these routes with the certain conditions, of course, that they'd have to meet the route that they'd laid out, build it in a certain period of time, and so forth.
The railways finally came to St. Croix County, and Daniel Baldwin played an influential role in bringing rail to the region. Baldwin wanted a railway through Hudson to connect his North Hudson mills to markets.
And so enter the picture for Hudson would be Daniel A. Baldwin and Jacob Humbird. Now Baldwin, he had the smarts. He knew how to get money together. He knew how to get things organized. He was a man who could promote things and really get things done. He had it all in his hands, but he knew nothing about railroads. So he found this man who was working in Brazil putting together railroads with his son, and that was Jacob Humbird. And they struck a deal that they would build the railroad to the St. Croix.
In the 1860s and 70s, northwestern Wisconsin experienced a frenzy of railroad building. The first of these rail lines to come through Hudson was the Tomah and Lake St. Croix Railway Company. This company was incorporated in 1863 with power to build a railroad from Tomah to Lake St. Croix. A few months after its organization, the company passed into the hands of Daniel Baldwin and Jacob Humbird, who began the construction of the road from Tomah via Black River Falls to Eau Claire and on to Hudson. Soon after this, the name was changed to West Wisconsin Railway. Bob DeBruzzi has studied the area railroad history for years, and he shares an interesting episode in the building of the early railroad at Hudson called the Battle of the Piles.
The railroad bridge in itself is a huge subject of history. There were a series of 3 bridges that were built finally. The last one was built in 1913. And that's the one that's in existence now and still operating. But the first one was a wood trestled bridge that went all the way across the St. Croix in a huge curve from North Hudson over to the Minnesota side. And it was a series of pony bridges till it got out to the big swing bridge. And it was built of wood. And this was the bridge, the very first one they built, that caused the big war between the loggers and the railroad people, because they wanted to float the logs down the river, and they didn't want a bridge with a bunch of timber sticking up out of the water blocking the log flow. So they actually had a battle. The loggers came down in steamboats, and the bridge was well under construction, and it had a pile driver there, and the crew was gone for the day, so they commandeered the pile driver and literally started to pull all the pilings out of the water. Well, then the sheriff from both St. Croix and Washington County had to get involved and call, and after 2 days they finally came to an agreement that they would enlarge the channel, enlarge the size of the swing bridge. That would allow a decent sized log flow to go through. So that's how that was settled. That bridge didn't last more than just a few years, and they realized they had to build one out of iron. And so they did, in fact, build a big swing bridge.
Despite this minor complication, the bridge was completed and the railroad finally made it to Hudson in November of 1871. Hudson was now connected to other major cities in the region. In the following years, several more railways were built through St. Croix County. One of these was a line from Hudson to River Falls, completed in 1878. The St. Croix, Superior, and Bayfield Company completed a line to Washburn, Bayfield, Ashland, and Superior in 1883. Management of this line was eventually turned over to the West Wisconsin Railway Company.
The West Wisconsin was then purchased by a group headed by H.H. Porter of Chicago. He was the mastermind behind putting the North Wisconsin and the former West Wisconsin together to create a railroad called the Chicago, St. Paul, and Minneapolis Railroad. Now that railroad didn't last very long. It was the predecessor to this one, which was in Hudson for a long, long time, the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha.
In 1881, various railroads were consolidated into the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railway. These roads and their branches are all a part of the Union Pacific Railroad today. Another line through St. Croix County was built by the Wisconsin Central Company. It enters the county at Glenwood City, passes through New Richmond, and then crosses the St. Croix River into Minnesota, about 4 miles west of Somerset. Started in 1882 and reaching the Twin Cities by 1884, this line is now part of Canadian National Railway. The area railways brought a great amount of industry to Hudson. With the support of Daniel Baldwin and the citizens of Hudson, the car repair shops of the Western Wisconsin line were moved to North Hudson from Eau Claire in 1872. In 1875, the offices for the Western Wisconsin and Northern Wisconsin Railway companies were also moved to Hudson. During this time, an average of 85 coaches and 900 freight cars were presided over by the car shops in North Hudson. Bob DeBrucy's father, Joe, worked in the car shops.
It felt immense, certainly. When I was young, and I would once in a while would be asked to run a bag lunch down to my dad at lunch hour. And you would go in there and it was just a hubbub of activity. There's a big group of buildings, and each building had its own assignment, its own, it all contributed to the building and the rebuilding of railroad cars. So there were wheel shops, tin shops, carpenter shops. There was industrial buildings where they had overhead cranes and they worked on heavy equipment. It was very interesting.
The 1872 car shops consisted of a 7-stall roundhouse, 2 shop buildings, offices, and an elegant residence for Mr. Baldwin. The shops suffered numerous fires to the original wood structures, and in 1890 the shops underwent extensive improvements that included 7 new brick and stone buildings, many of which still stand. Over the years, several buildings were added, including a machine shop, a wheel shop, a blacksmith shop, a freight car repair shop, a passenger car shop, 2 paint shops. Other buildings were used for brass cleaning, upholstery, and storage, and 2 70-foot transfer tables.
The whole complex was laid out with railroad tracks feeding through each building. The railroad and the shops, where any job on the railroad was considered dangerous. There were lots and lots of injuries and a lot of more carelessness, but that's not the point. The point is that they wanted dearly to maintain as clean a record as far as accidents was concerned that they could. So for insurance purposes, they promoted safety, and they had huge signs up around the shop yards touting the number of days they've had without a lost day accident. And so one day a heavy piece of steel fell on my dad's foot, and it caused considerable damage, and they hauled him downtown to the doctor. They had their own doctor, but I mean, it was probably Dr. Newton, if I remember correctly. He was, beside being a local doctor, he was hired by the railroad to take care of all their issues. And so late that day, my dad came home, and he was hobbled into the house and went and laid down on the couch, and around 4:30 or 5 o'clock, the superintendent of the railroad came knocking at the door. Came in, he wanted to talk to Joe. So my mother showed him in, and he sat down, and he said, "Now, Joe, we would like you to come to work every day. Now, we don't want you to work or anything like that. We'll get you down there, and we'll get you upstairs at the upholstery shop. We'll set you up in a bed, and you can have all the care you need there. But we just think it's important you punch in and punch out every day." So consequently, they didn't have a lost day accident, even though he was not able to work for several weeks.
During the 1920s and the 1930s, somewhere between 500 and 700 men were employed by the rail company in Hudson. All of this industry drew great numbers of men to North Hudson. One notable group were the Italians who came from Cumberland and other places to work in the shops. These men and their families built houses and started a community, and by June 1912, North Hudson was incorporated as a village with a population of 586. By this time, the railroads had clearly left their mark on the Hudson area. The Hudson car shops operated for 85 years. The closing was announced in July of 1956, and by October only 19 men remained. It is said that night watchman Ole Shirley was the last man out of the gate in 1958. The name Phipps is prominently displayed in one of Hudson's largest buildings. The Phipps Center for the Arts is named after one of the city's most civic-minded men, William H. Phipps, who came to Hudson in 1875.
Well, my wife and I, Mary Ellen and I, acquired the Phipps Inn Bed and Breakfast in the year 2000. The house was built in 1884. William and Frances Phipps are the ones who had it built back then, and that's where the name comes from. William Phipps was in the railroad business to start with. He was land commissioner for a number of smaller railroads that eventually became known as the Omaha Railroad in the area, and was with them until 1893. And at that time, he resigned from them and became land commissioner for the Northern Pacific Railroad.
Phipps had come here as an official of the West Wisconsin Railroad, and he was an investor, and later he became a land agent for the Northern Pacific Railroad, and he was a very wealthy man, and he made a great fortune. The Phipps Foundation, of course, was founded by his son, but Mr. Phipps was a very fine man.
But he was also involved in many other things in the area, and he started off in politics on the county board, ended up in the state senate after being mayor of the city for several terms. And in the banking, he was on the board of directors for the First National Bank of Hudson and ended up being president of that bank. He lived until 1924, and about 25 years after he passed away, his son Stephen started a foundation in his name. Through that foundation, they gave back some of their family wealth doing various community projects. First big project was to help build a hospital, and that was completed in 1953. The next big project was in the early 1980s. They created the Phipps Center for the Arts.
Longtime Hudson resident Dick Mueller talks about the formation of the Phipps Center for the Arts.
1977-78, interest rates went up to about 14 to 16%. And the Phipps money multiplied. They had to give so much away a year, or they had to pay taxes. They had to give the money to the government. I think the Erdmans were quite instrumental in the group. Jack Erdman and his wife June. And they came and talked to me about the Phipps Center. And it's became an outlet for many treasures that came to Hudson. And I think Mr. Phipps would have been proud. The hospital was already built and didn't need as much money for that. And Mr. Phipps had no children, and his money had to be given away inside the city of Hudson, Wisconsin. We benefited greatly from the Phipps family. Mr. Phipps' dad owned the bank, and Mr. Phipps, instead of being involved in the bank in Hudson, he decided to go make his money out in Seattle and British Columbia and duplicate what the people did in Hudson, where they bought the land, sold the lumber, and then sold the land. And that's how he made his money. He was a very ordinary person. He would go for walks in the wintertime, and he'd wear like a railroad hat and a red plaid jacket and go for a hike. And you'd think that he might be a lumberjack, or he might be a common ordinary person and not a multimillionaire. And he was very pleasant person, and very soft. And very giving.
Stephen established the William H. Phipps Foundation in 1947, and over the years the foundation has had a vast impact on the area, benefiting hospitals, schools, the arts, and numerous other organizations. Stephen donated the remainder of the Phipps fortune to the foundation when he passed away in 1977.